There's a dangerous misunderstanding about why empaths attract narcissists, and most people never question it deeply enough to see what's actually happening beneath the surface. The common explanation is simple, almost comforting in a way. People say it's because empaths are too kind, too giving, too trusting. They say it's because narcissists take advantage of that kindness, because they prey on it, because they exploit it. And while there is a fragment of truth in that idea, it is far too shallow to explain the pattern you've probably seen repeat itself again and again, not just in your life, but in the lives of others who share that same emotional depth. Because if it were only about kindness, then anyone kind would consistently attract narcissists. But that's not what happens. There are people who are generous, polite, even selfless, who never find themselves in these deeply entangled, emotionally complex dynamics. And then there are empaths, who seem to step into these patterns almost predictably, as if something deeper is guiding the connection before it even fully forms. So the question becomes more precise, more uncomfortable, and far more revealing. What is it about an empath that creates this level of attraction? What is it that narcissists are actually responding to? To understand this, you have to move beyond surface-level traits and into something far more fundamental. Because what draws people in is not just behavior. It's not just how you act or what you say. It's something far less visible, something that operates beneath conscious awareness. And in the case of an empath, that something is what we can call their light. But even that word is often misunderstood. People hear light and immediately think of warmth, positivity, emotional softness. They imagine someone who is endlessly supportive, endlessly patient, endlessly available. And while those qualities can exist within an empath, they are not the core of what makes their presence so powerful. At its core, an empath's light is awareness. It is perception without distortion. It is the ability to feel what is unspoken, to recognize what is hidden, to sense what others are trying to avoid even within themselves. It is a kind of clarity that doesn't need to be announced, doesn't need to be proven, and often doesn't even need to be consciously used. It simply exists, and that existence alone begins to shape every interaction, every dynamic, every connection that forms around it. Now here is where the pattern begins to take shape. Most people move through life managing discomfort rather than confronting it. They build identities that protect them, narratives that justify them, emotional strategies that allow them to avoid facing what feels too difficult to acknowledge. This is not necessarily malicious. It's human. It's a defense mechanism that allows people to function without constantly being overwhelmed by their own contradictions. But it comes at a cost, because maintaining that internal structure requires constant reinforcement. It requires denial. It requires distance from truth. And then, into that carefully maintained structure, an empath enters. Not intentionally disruptive, not trying to expose anything, not trying to challenge anyone. But their presence alone introduces something that cannot be easily controlled. Because awareness has a unique property. It doesn't force change, but it makes illusion harder to sustain. It doesn't attack, but it reveals. And when someone who has spent years avoiding certain parts of themselves comes into contact with that kind of presence, something subtle begins to happen internally. They feel seen, not in the obvious sense, where secrets are spoken or truths are directly confronted, but in a much quieter, more unsettling way. It's the feeling that someone understands more than you've shown, that they can sense something you haven't fully admitted even to yourself. And for someone who relies on maintaining a specific self-image, that feeling can be deeply destabilizing, because it introduces a kind of psychological tension they are not prepared to resolve. This is where the misunderstanding begins to fall apart, because narcissists are not simply drawn to kindness. They are drawn to something far more specific. They are drawn to the stabilizing, regulating, clarifying presence of someone who can unconsciously hold emotional weight that they themselves cannot process. They are drawn to the empath's ability to create a sense of coherence in an otherwise fragmented internal world. And they don't always understand this consciously. In fact, most of the time, they don't understand it at all. They simply feel it. They feel calmer, more grounded, more understood, more complete in some intangible way. And that feeling is powerful. It creates a kind of attachment that can be mistaken for connection, for chemistry, even for something deeper or more meaningful. But what's actually happening is far more complex. Because what they are responding to is not just who you are as a person. It is what your presence does for them internally. And this is why the pattern repeats. Because as long as that internal need exists, as long as that lack of stability, clarity, and self-awareness remains unresolved, they will continue to seek out the same type of energy. They will continue to be drawn to the same kind of presence. Not because they are consciously choosing empaths, but because something in them recognizes, at a level beneath logic, that this is where relief exists. And if you've ever found yourself in this pattern, if you've ever wondered why the same types of people seem to enter your life, why the same emotional dynamics seem to unfold no matter how much you try to change the outcome, then this is where understanding begins. Because it was never random. It was never accidental. It was always structured around something deeper than behavior. And once you start to see that structure clearly, you begin to understand something that changes everything. The attraction was never about weakness. It was about something far more powerful than that. Something that, once fully understood, will force you to rethink not just who you attract, but why they were drawn to you in the first place. To fully understand why this dynamic becomes so intense, you have to look deeper into the internal world of a narcissist. Because what appears on the surface is often the exact opposite of what is happening underneath. From the outside, a narcissist can appear confident, composed, even dominant. They may present themselves as someone who knows exactly who they are, someone who commands attention, someone who doesn't need validation because they seem to already possess it. But this outward presentation is not stability. It is structure. And that structure is built very carefully to compensate for something much less stable beneath it. At the core, a narcissist operates from a fragmented sense of self. Their identity is not internally anchored in a consistent, grounded understanding of who they are. Instead, it is constructed externally, through reactions, through validation, through control of how they are perceived. This means their sense of worth is not something they carry within themselves. It is something they constantly have to extract from the environment around them. And because of that, they are always searching, always scanning, always unconsciously looking for sources that can provide that reinforcement. This is where the dynamic begins to align with the empath in a way that feels almost inevitable. Because an empath, by their very nature, does something most people do not do consistently. They pay attention at a deeper level. They listen in a way that makes people feel understood. They validate emotional experiences without immediately dismissing or minimizing them. They create a psychological space where someone can exist without feeling judged or rejected. And to a well-adjusted individual, this feels like trust. It feels like connection. But to someone whose internal world lacks stability, it feels like something else entirely. It feels like access. And access is where the attachment begins to deepen. Because when a narcissist encounters someone who can understand them without requiring them to fully understand themselves, it creates a kind of shortcut. It allows them to bypass the difficult work of self-reflection, self-awareness, and internal growth. Instead of building their own sense of clarity, they begin to rely on yours. Instead of regulating their own emotions, they begin to lean on your ability to do it for them. And this process does not feel manipulative in the beginning. It feels natural. It feels like something that is simply unfolding on its own. But underneath that natural progression, a pattern is forming. Because what starts as appreciation slowly becomes reliance. What begins as admiration gradually shifts into expectation. And this shift is so subtle that it often goes unnoticed, especially by the empath. At first, it feels meaningful to be needed. It feels purposeful to be able to bring clarity, to reduce confusion, to help someone feel more stable. There is a sense that you are making a difference, that your presence has value, that the connection is deepening in a way that matters. But the imbalance is already there. Because, in a healthy dynamic, emotional exchange moves toward reciprocity. Both individuals contribute. Both individuals grow. Both individuals take responsibility for their own internal state while still supporting each other. But in this dynamic, something different happens. The more you give, the more they take. And the more they take, the more they begin to depend on what you provide, not as a shared experience, but as a resource they can access. This is the point where the relationship quietly shifts from connection to consumption. And this is also where the phrase craving your light becomes more than just a metaphor. Because what they are drawn to is not just your personality, your kindness, or your presence. It is the function you serve in their internal world. You provide clarity where they feel confusion. You provide stability where they feel chaos. You provide understanding where they feel misunderstood. And that combination creates something they are not equipped to generate on their own. So they stay close to it. They engage with it. They rely on it. But at the same time, something else is happening beneath the surface. Something that makes this dynamic far more complex than simple attraction or dependence. Because while they crave the stability you bring, they are also confronted by something they are not prepared to face. Your awareness does not just regulate them. It reflects them. It highlights inconsistencies. It reveals gaps. It makes visible the difference between what they present and what they actually experience internally. And this is where the tension begins to build. Because human beings do not just respond to what comforts them. They also react to what challenges their identity. And when someone who has built their sense of self on external validation is placed in front of someone who embodies internal clarity, that contrast becomes impossible to ignore. It creates a kind of silent comparison. Not one that is spoken, not one that is openly acknowledged, but one that is felt. They begin to sense that you operate differently, that you process emotions differently, that you are not dependent on the same external reinforcement they rely on. And that realization introduces discomfort. Not because you have done anything wrong, and not because you have actively pointed anything out, but because your very way of being represents something they have not developed within themselves. And instead of responding to that awareness with curiosity or growth, many narcissistic individuals respond in a different way. They begin to reinterpret it. They begin to shift how they see you, not based on who you are, but based on how your presence makes them feel. This is the beginning of a very subtle, but very important transformation in the dynamic. Because what once felt supportive can begin to feel overwhelming. What once felt grounding can begin to feel exposing. What once felt like connection can begin to feel like pressure. And none of this is happening on the surface in an obvious way. It unfolds gradually, internally, often without clear communication or direct confrontation. But the shift is real. And once it begins, the relationship is no longer operating in the same space it started in. Because now the very thing they were drawn to is the same thing that is quietly challenging them. And when that happens, the dynamic doesn't simply stay stable. It evolves. It changes direction. And that change is where the next phase of this pattern begins to reveal itself in a way that most empaths don't expect, and often don't understand until it has already taken hold. And this is the point where the dynamic begins to change in a way that feels confusing, almost disorienting, especially from the empath's perspective. Because everything that initially felt natural, even meaningful, starts to shift in tone. Not dramatically at first. Not in a way that is immediately obvious, but subtly, gradually, in ways that are difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. The same person who once seemed drawn to your presence, who appreciated your understanding, who felt grounded around you, begins to respond differently. Their energy changes. Their tone shifts. Their behavior becomes inconsistent. And from your perspective, it feels disproportionate. Because there was no clear conflict. No direct confrontation. Nothing that would logically explain such a change. But the trigger was never external. It was always internal. Because by this stage, something important has already happened beneath the surface. The narcissist is no longer just experiencing the comfort of your presence. They are also experiencing the contrast it creates. And that contrast becomes increasingly difficult for them to ignore. Your ability to remain emotionally stable to process things with clarity, to see through inconsistencies without reacting impulsively, begins to highlight something they have not developed within themselves. And that awareness, even if it remains unconscious, creates tension. Not the kind of tension that leads to growth, but the kind that leads to resistance. Because growth requires confrontation. It requires looking inward, acknowledging what is unresolved, and taking responsibility for it. But someone who is deeply invested in maintaining a certain self-image is not always willing to engage in that process. So, instead of confronting the internal discomfort, they begin to externalize it. And the easiest place to direct that discomfort is toward you. This is where the shift from attraction to resentment begins to take shape. Not as a loud, obvious rejection, but as something quieter, more subtle, more difficult to identify. It can show up as passive-aggressive comments, as dismissiveness, as a slight edge in their tone that wasn't there before. It can appear as criticism that feels unnecessary, or reactions that feel out of proportion to what actually happened. And because these changes are not always direct, they can leave you questioning yourself. You might start wondering if you said something wrong, if you misread the situation, if you somehow caused the shift without realizing it. And this is where many empaths begin to turn inward in a way that reinforces the dynamic. Because your natural response is to understand, to analyze, to try to restore balance. You begin to adjust your behavior, to soften your presence, to be more careful with your words, to avoid triggering whatever change you sense has taken place. But the reality is, this was never about what you said or did. It was about what your presence represents. Because at this stage, the narcissist is no longer just experiencing your light as something that provides comfort. They are also experiencing it as something that reveals what they are not ready to see. And that creates a psychological conflict that cannot be easily resolved. On one side, they are still drawn to the stability and clarity you provide. On the other side, they feel exposed by it. And when those two forces exist at the same time, something has to give. And more often than not, what gives is how they begin to see you. They start to reinterpret your qualities in a way that reduces the discomfort. Your insight becomes overanalyzing. Your emotional depth becomes intensity. Your consistency becomes predictability. Your awareness becomes something that feels intrusive, even if you are not actively pointing anything out. These labels are not accurate reflections of who you are. They are defensive mechanisms. They allow them to shift the focus away from their own internal conflict and place it onto something external. And once that reinterpretation takes hold, the dynamic continues to shift. What once felt like appreciation turns into expectation. What once felt like connection begins to feel one-sided. And what once felt like mutual engagement slowly becomes something that revolves around their needs, their emotions, their instability. And this is where the emotional drain begins to intensify, often without you fully recognizing it at first. Because you are still operating from the same place you started. You are still trying to understand, still trying to support, still trying to maintain the connection that once felt genuine. But the structure of the dynamic has already changed. It is no longer built on mutual exchange. It is built on imbalance. And the more you try to restore that balance by giving more, the more the imbalance increases. This is one of the most difficult aspects of this pattern for empaths to fully accept, because it challenges a deeply held belief that effort can fix disconnection, that more understanding can create clarity, that more patience can restore harmony. But in a dynamic like this, the issue is not a lack of effort. It is the structure itself. It was never designed to be balanced. It was built around extraction, not reciprocity. And this is where the emotional confusion reaches its peak. Because from your perspective, you were consistent. You were supportive. You showed up in a way that was genuine and real. So when the other person becomes distant, critical, or even hostile, it feels like a betrayal of something that was once meaningful. But from their perspective, something else has been happening. The more they relied on you, the more they began to measure themselves against you. And that comparison, even if it remains unconscious, creates discomfort. Because your ability to navigate emotions, to maintain clarity, to remain grounded, highlights a gap in their own capacity. And instead of using that awareness as motivation to grow, they respond by reducing the source of that discomfort. And the easiest way to do that is by changing how they perceive you. This is why the shift often feels sudden, even though it has been building over time. Because once the internal tension reaches a certain point, the external behavior begins to reflect it more clearly. The distance becomes more noticeable. The criticism becomes more direct. The emotional inconsistency becomes harder to ignore. And at that point, the dynamic has fully transitioned from attraction into something else entirely. Something that no longer feels like connection, but something that still holds you in place. And this is where many empaths find themselves asking a question that is both simple and deeply complicated at the same time. How did something that felt so real become something that feels so draining? The answer lies in understanding that what you experienced at the beginning was not entirely false, but it was incomplete. It was built on a need that could not sustain itself without eventually creating tension. And once that tension reached the surface, the dynamic revealed what it had always been structured around. Not mutual growth, but emotional dependence. And once you see that clearly, you begin to understand why this pattern does not resolve itself through effort alone. Because the issue was never how much you gave. It was where the connection was rooted from the very beginning. At this stage, something important begins to happen inside the empath. And it often starts so quietly that it's easy to overlook. There's no dramatic moment, no clear turning point where everything suddenly becomes obvious. Instead, it begins as a subtle awareness, a feeling that something about this dynamic is no longer sustainable. You start to notice patterns you once ignored. You begin to feel the weight of interactions that used to feel natural. And slowly, almost reluctantly, you start to recognize that what you've been giving is not being met with the same level of awareness or reciprocity. This realization is not comfortable, because for an empath, understanding others has always been a strength. It's something that has guided your interactions, shaped your relationships, and created a sense of purpose in how you connect with people. So when you begin to see that this same strength is being used in a way that drains you rather than supports you, it creates a kind of internal conflict. A part of you wants to maintain the connection, to preserve what once felt meaningful. But another part of you is beginning to see the truth more clearly. And that truth leads to change. Not a reactive, emotional change, but a grounded, deliberate shift in how you engage. You begin setting boundaries. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. You start to say no in situations where you would have previously said yes. You pause instead of immediately responding. You become more selective with your time, your attention, your energy. And most importantly, you stop overextending yourself in dynamics that are not balanced. From your perspective, this feels like alignment. It feels like a correction, like a return to something more stable, more honest. But from the perspective of someone who has grown accustomed to your previous level of availability, it feels very different. It feels like loss. And loss, especially when it is not understood, often leads to resistance. This is where the dynamic enters another critical phase. Because boundaries don't just limit behavior. They redefine relationships. They change the structure of interaction. They introduce a level of accountability that wasn't there before. And for someone who has been relying on your openness without having to develop their own internal stability, this shift can feel threatening. Not because the boundary itself is unreasonable, but because it disrupts a pattern they have come to depend on. Now here is where the psychological response becomes very revealing. People don't react to boundaries based on what the boundary is. They react based on what the boundary takes away from them. And if someone has been used to having consistent access to your emotional support, your clarity, your patience, then even a small boundary can feel significant. It can feel like something has changed fundamentally, even if what you are doing is completely reasonable. So they respond, sometimes directly by questioning your behavior, by challenging the boundary, by trying to negotiate around it. Other times indirectly, through subtle testing, seeing if you will return to old patterns when pressure is applied. And in some cases, the response becomes emotional. Frustration turns into criticism. Discomfort turns into distance. And clarity, your clarity, becomes the target. You might hear things like, "You've changed," or "You're not the same anymore," or even more subtle remarks that imply something is wrong with your shift in behavior. And in a literal sense, they are right. You have changed. But not in the way they are suggesting. You haven't become colder. You've become more precise. You haven't withdrawn your care. You've redefined how it is expressed. You haven't become less empathetic. You become more intentional about where that empathy is directed. The problem is, this distinction is not always recognized. Because, from their perspective, the change is measured by access. And when access decreases, it is interpreted as rejection. This is where insecurity begins to surface more clearly. Because boundaries require the other person to take responsibility for their own emotional state, their own expectations, their own behavior. And for someone who has been relying on you to regulate those things, this shift can feel uncomfortable. So instead of adjusting internally, they attempt to restore the previous dynamic externally. They push against the boundary. They test it. They try to reestablish the level of access they once had. And when those attempts don't work, the response can become more pronounced. The frustration becomes more visible. The resentment becomes more defined. The subtle tension that once existed beneath the surface now begins to appear in more direct ways. And this is often where the empath feels the strongest pull to revert. Because you can sense the discomfort. You can feel the shift in energy. You can recognize that something has changed. And there's a part of you that wants to restore harmony, to ease the tension, to make things feel stable again. But this is where the real challenge begins. Because every time you compromise a boundary to preserve someone else's comfort, you reinforce the very dynamic that was draining you in the first place. You send a message, both to them and to yourself, that your limits are flexible under pressure. And once that pattern is established, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain any form of consistency. So the real strength required at this stage is not in setting the boundary. It is in holding it, quietly, consistently, without the need to justify it repeatedly or soften it to make it more acceptable. And this kind of strength is different from what most people expect. It's not loud. It's not confrontational. It's not about winning an argument or proving a point. It's about allowing someone to have their reaction without taking responsibility for it. It's about tolerating their discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. It's about understanding that their response is not always a reflection of something you've done wrong, but often a reflection of what they are not ready to adjust within themselves. Because when you stop managing how others feel about your boundaries, something important becomes visible. The true nature of the relationship reveals itself. People who value you will adjust. They may not immediately understand the change, but they will recognize its validity over time. They will meet you with a level of respect that reflects their own internal stability. But people who are primarily benefiting from your lack of boundaries will struggle. Not because the boundary is unfair, but because it removes something they were not prepared to lose. And in that struggle, their behavior becomes clear. The resistance, the frustration, the attempts to regain control. All of it becomes visible in a way that was not as obvious before. And that visibility is not a problem. It is information. It tells you who was connected to you and who was connected to your availability. And once you see that distinction clearly, something shifts within you again. You stop trying to maintain every connection at the same level. You stop over-explaining your limits. You stop negotiating your well-being in order to preserve dynamics that were never balanced to begin with. Because at this stage, you begin to understand something that changes how you approach every relationship moving forward. Boundaries are not about creating distance. They are about defining where you end and someone else begins. And the people who are unsettled by that definition are often the ones who are benefiting from its absence. And once you recognize that, you begin to hold your position differently, not from defensiveness, not from anger, but from clarity. And that clarity becomes the foundation for what comes next. There comes a point where the shift is no longer just about boundaries, no longer just about how you engage or what you tolerate. It becomes something deeper, something internal that begins to reshape how you see everything, including yourself. And this is where the final layer of this pattern reveals itself, not in the behavior of the narcissist, but in the evolution of the empath. Because once you've seen the pattern clearly, once you felt the imbalance, once you've experienced the cycle of attraction, dependence, and eventual tension, something inside you begins to reorganize. Your standards change. Your tolerance shifts. What once felt normal no longer feels acceptable. What once felt like connection now feels like overextension. And this is not because you've become less empathetic. It's because your awareness has matured into something more structured, more grounded, more discerning. And that kind of growth is disruptive. Not in a loud, external way, but in a quiet, internal way that changes how you move through relationships. You begin to listen differently. You begin to observe more than you react. You no longer feel the same urgency to fix, to explain, or to carry emotional weight that doesn't belong to you. There is a shift from participation to observation, from reaction to intention. And from the inside, this feels like alignment. It feels like you are finally operating from a place that is consistent with who you actually are. But from the outside, especially for those who were used to your previous version, it feels like something else entirely. It feels like distance. It feels like withdrawal. It feels like you've become someone different. And, in a literal sense, you have. But not in the way they interpret it. Because what they are noticing is not a loss of who you were. It is the emergence of who you've become after understanding what your energy, your attention, and your presence are actually worth. And that realization creates a new kind of tension, one that is no longer based on dependency, but on contrast. Because growth does not happen in isolation. It happens in comparison, in contrast, in the silent recognition of differences in awareness, responsibility, and emotional maturity. And when you begin to operate from a place of clarity, it naturally highlights where others are not. Not intentionally. Not in a way that you are actively pointing out, but simply by existing in a different way. And for someone who has not made that same internal shift, that contrast can feel uncomfortable. Not because you are doing anything to create distance, but because your presence now reflects something they are not ready to confront. It reflects the possibility of change. It reflects the idea that patterns can be broken, that behavior can evolve, that awareness can deepen. And for someone who is still operating within the same patterns, that reflection can feel like pressure. So once again, they reinterpret. They begin to label your growth in a way that protects their current position. Your calm becomes indifference. Your selectivity becomes distance. Your clarity becomes rigidity. Your silence becomes judgment. These interpretations are not objective. They are defensive. They allow them to maintain their current identity without having to engage in the discomfort that growth requires. And this is where the final understanding begins to take shape. Because at this stage, the dynamic is no longer about why they were attracted to you or why the relationship became unbalanced. It becomes about what your growth now represents, both to you and to them. And what it represents is something that cannot be negotiated or adjusted to preserve comfort. It represents truth. Not the kind of truth that needs to be spoken or enforced, but the kind that exists in how you live, how you engage, how you choose where your energy goes. And truth has a unique property. It does not require validation. It does not require agreement. It simply exists. And in doing so, it separates what is aligned from what is not. This is why some relationships begin to dissolve at this stage. Not because of conflict, not because of a specific event, but because the structure that once held them together no longer exists. Because when one person evolves beyond the dynamic that defined the connection, the relationship either adapts or it fades. And not all relationships are built to adapt. Some are built on shared patterns, shared levels of awareness, shared ways of engaging with the world. And when those shared elements no longer exist, the connection changes naturally. This is not failure. This is clarity. And this is where many empaths face one of the most difficult realizations of all. The need to stop trying to maintain connections that require them to step back into a version of themselves they have already outgrown. Because there is a strong instinct to preserve what once felt meaningful, to hold on to the idea that if you just explain more, give more, or adjust slightly, the connection can return to what it was. But what it was is no longer aligned with who you are now. And trying to maintain that version of the connection creates internal conflict, because it requires you to ignore the very awareness that allowed you to grow in the first place. It requires you to reduce your clarity, to soften your boundaries, to re-enter patterns you have already recognized as unsustainable. And that is where the real choice exists, not in changing the other person, not in fixing the dynamic, but in deciding whether you are willing to remain aligned with your own growth, even if it creates distance, even if it changes how others perceive you, even if it leads to the natural ending of connections that cannot evolve with you. Because this is the point where your light takes on a different role. It is no longer something that others simply respond to. It becomes something you are responsible for directing, where you place it, who has access to it, how it is shared, and under what conditions it remains protected. And this is where the pattern truly breaks. Not when narcissists stop being drawn to you, but when you stop unconsciously offering what they are seeking without understanding the cost. Because the truth is, they may still recognize your light. They may still feel drawn to it. They may still sense the stability, the clarity, the awareness that you carry. But what changes is your response. You no longer interpret that attraction as connection. You no longer confuse need with depth. You no longer assume that intensity means alignment. Instead, you observe. You assess. You recognize patterns early. And most importantly, you choose differently. And that is the final shift. Because once you reach that level of awareness, your life is no longer defined by who is drawn to you. It is defined by who you allow to stay. And that distinction changes everything. Because the moment your light is no longer something you give freely, without discernment, is the moment it stops being something that can be easily consumed. It becomes something that is respected, valued, and protected. And not everyone will be able to meet you at that level. But that is not a loss. That is alignment. Because in the end, narcissists were never just drawn to your light because of what it gave them. They were drawn to it because of what they lacked. And the moment you stop compensating for that lack is the moment you finally see the difference between being needed and being truly valued. And once you see that difference clearly, you don't go back. Because clarity, once fully realized, does not disappear. It becomes the foundation for every decision you make moving forward. And that is where real power begins. And this is where everything finally comes together. Not as a theory, not as something abstract, but as a pattern you can now recognize in real time. Because once you understand the full structure of this dynamic, the attraction, the dependency, the shift, the resentment, and the eventual need for boundaries, you begin to see something that was always there, but never fully visible before. You begin to see the difference between attention and intention. Because one of the most deceptive aspects of this entire pattern is how intense it feels in the beginning. The connection feels immediate. The engagement feels deep. The emotional exchange feels meaningful. And because empaths are wired to respond to emotional depth, that intensity is often interpreted as something significant. It feels like you've found someone who understands you, someone who connects with you in a way that others don't. But intensity is not the same as alignment. And this is one of the most important distinctions you can carry forward. Because narcissistic dynamics are often built on intensity. They create emotional highs and lows that feel powerful, that feel engaging, that feel real. But what they lack is consistency. They lack stability. They lack the kind of grounded mutual investment that defines a healthy connection. And this is why so many empaths find themselves caught in these cycles longer than they expect. Because the emotional experience is convincing. It feels like something is happening. It feels like something important is unfolding. But what's actually happening is a cycle of need being mistaken for connection. And once you see that clearly, something begins to change in how you interpret people, not just narcissists, but everyone who enters your life. You stop being drawn in by intensity alone. You start paying attention to patterns. You begin to observe how someone behaves over time, not just how they present themselves in the beginning. You notice how they respond when things don't go their way. You notice how they handle boundaries. You notice whether they take responsibility for their actions or shift blame externally. You notice whether their presence brings stability or creates confusion. And these observations become far more important than any initial feeling of connection. Because feelings can be misleading. They can be influenced by chemistry, by familiarity, by unconscious patterns that repeat themselves without your awareness. But patterns, when observed consistently, reveal truth. And truth, once recognized, gives you something you didn't have before. Choice. The ability to choose differently. The ability to disengage early when something doesn't align. The ability to recognize when someone is drawn to you for what you provide rather than who you are. And most importantly, the ability to step out of dynamics that would have once held you in place. This is where the cycle breaks completely. Not because narcissists stop existing, not because they stop being drawn to your light, but because you are no longer unconsciously participating in the pattern. You are no longer interpreting their attention as validation. You are no longer confusing their need with genuine connection. You are no longer staying in situations that require you to overextend yourself just to maintain balance. And this shift changes the outcome before the pattern even has a chance to fully develop. Because the early stages are where everything is decided, not at the point of conflict, not when the dynamic has already become draining, but at the point of recognition, at the moment where you see the signs and choose not to ignore them. And this is where self-respect becomes the defining factor. Because self-respect is not something that appears suddenly. It is something that is built through awareness, through experience, through the willingness to accept uncomfortable truths and act on them. It is the decision to prioritize alignment over attachment. It is the understanding that not every connection deserves to be maintained. It is the recognition that your presence, your energy, your clarity are not resources to be distributed without discernment. And once that understanding becomes internal, something shifts permanently. You stop seeking to be understood by everyone. You stop trying to prove your value through how much you give. You stop measuring the strength of a connection by how intense it feels. Instead, you begin to measure it by something far more stable. Mutuality, consistency, respect, the ability for both individuals to exist as whole, independent people without relying on the other to fill internal gaps. And this is what separates real connection from emotional dependency. Because real connection does not require you to lose yourself. It does not require you to constantly adjust, constantly give, constantly manage the emotional state of the other person. It exists in balance. It grows through shared awareness. It is sustained through reciprocity. And once you experience that kind of connection even briefly, it becomes much harder to accept anything less. This is why growth is so powerful in this context. Because it recalibrates what feels normal. It raises your baseline. It changes what you are willing to tolerate. And once that baseline shifts, the patterns that once felt familiar begin to feel uncomfortable, even obvious. And this is where your light takes on its final form. Not as something that attracts. Not as something that others respond to. But as something that you consciously direct. Something that you protect. Something that you choose where and how it is expressed. Because the truth is, your light was never the problem. It was never the reason things became unbalanced. It was never something that needed to be reduced, hidden, or softened. The only thing that needed to change was how it was given. And once that changes, everything else follows. Because people will still be drawn to you. They will still recognize the clarity, the stability, the awareness that you carry. But now, that recognition is no longer enough to gain access. Now, it has to be matched. It has to be earned through consistency, through respect, through the ability to meet you at the same level of awareness that you bring into the dynamic. And not everyone will be able to do that. But that is not something to be fixed. That is something to be accepted. Because your role is not to bring everyone up to your level. Your role is to recognize who is already willing to meet you there. And once you begin to operate from that understanding, something shifts in a way that is both subtle and profound. You stop asking why certain people were drawn to you, and you start asking why you allowed them to stay. And that question changes everything, because it moves the focus from external patterns to internal responsibility, from confusion to clarity, from repetition to choice. And once you have that level of awareness, the pattern that once defined your experiences no longer has the same power over you. Because now you are no longer reacting to it. You are recognizing it. And that recognition is what creates freedom, not from attracting certain types of people, but from being affected by them in the same way. Because in the end, the most important shift is not who is drawn to your light. It is what you choose to do with it once they are. And that is where everything truly changes.